Hey everybody, Craig Warwick here and welcome to The Workshop, the video series where I take you through my action figure customizing process, giving you a more in-depth look at my work, and in this episode I'm going to be talking about my figure of Kang the Conqueror. First up, if you're watching this video then it means enough people have hit the like button over on my showcase of Kang, so thanks to those guys and of course to anyone who hits the like button on this video too. I'm going to be breaking this video down into the 3 stages of my customizing process. Stage 1, inspiration. Stage 2, research. And stage 3, customizing. So let's get cracking with inspiration. To my way of thinking, Kang has always been one of the really big bad guys when it comes to Marvel supervillains, and this really goes back to his inclusion in the Secret Wars comic event from 1984. This was my big introduction, or indoctrination in some ways, to Marvel Comics. This event became the template for big comic book crossovers and featured Marvel's biggest heroes battling their biggest villains. More importantly, it featured a line of action figures by Mattel, and this was the real draw for a lot of kids, let's face it. The first wave of figures featured 4 heroes and 4 villains, the real heavy hitters and recognisable characters like Spider-Man, Captain America, Iron Man. Everyone knew who those guys were even at that time, but the other characters were so simple to understand just from the figure. Wolverine was a new name at the time, but come on, he's a guy with claws, kids can understand that. The same went for the villains, which were never as well known as the heroes. Dr. Doom looked like a bad robot guy. I mean, we know he's not that, but that's what the action figure design wanted kids to get from him. Dr. Octopus is easy to understand with those robotic tentacles. Magneto, well, it's all in the name really. And then rounding out the villainous 4 was Kang? Well, the name isn't anything descriptive, so his look might give us an idea of what his powers are. Yeah, I'm not getting anything from that. The box said time travelling conqueror battles for evil. Okay, so time travel, that's pretty cool. Let's look at what he does in the comic. Okay, he sneakily takes a pot shot at Dr. Doom, then when that goes wrong he gets disintegrated. Cool. Well done, Kang. So kids the world over have this Kang figure and have no idea who he really is or really why he got a figure in the first place. Was Kang Marvel's first peg warmer? One for the history books, perhaps. But one thing this did for me was make me curious about the character, but from what little I read about him in the decade that followed, Kang just came across as a ranting madman with convoluted time travel storylines. Curiosity finally turned to inspiration though in the storylines Avengers Forever and the Kang Dynasty. Writer Kurt Busiek reinvented a Kang who had become tired of using time travel, traps and guile to strike sneakily at his enemies. Kang was rejuvenated to glory in the heat of battle and to live for matching force and strategy with his enemies, defeating them through the art of war. This was a Kang that inspired me, and he's been on my list of wanted action figures ever since. So, with the inspiration settled, we move on to research. Kang is a big character to research in comics. He has a very long lifespan, and through his journeys through time, he has taken on many identities. So I'm going to try and keep this simple and focus on those that influenced my figure. Kang the Conqueror first appears in Avengers issue 8 in 1964. He comes from the future to conquer the Earth and the Avengers, and of course gets his arse handed to him and retreats back through time. But this isn't actually the first appearance of the character. You see, the man who would become Kang appeared the year before in Fantastic Four issue 19. On a jaunt through time to ancient Egypt, the Fantastic Four came up against the evil pharaoh Rama-Tut. Rama-Tut revealed himself to be a man from the 30th century who grew bored with the peaceful society he lived in. So, as you do when you get a bit bored, he found his ancestors' designs for a time machine, built it and headed back to ancient Egypt, where he was made pharaoh and worshipped like a god due to his future technologies. It's unclear whether Kang's ancestor is Dr. Doom, Reed Richards' father, or both perhaps, but either way, the time traveller known as Rama-Tut also got his arse handed to him by the Fantastic Four. So he retreated through time to the 30th century, but overshot it and ended up in the 40th. This was a time of total war. Mankind had descended into barbarism, naively using high-tech weapons they no longer had the mental capacity to understand to wage constant war. Rama-Tut was able to use his knowledge of technology to understand their weaponry, fashion a 40th century battlesuit for himself, questionable fashion sense included, and conquer their world, establishing himself as Kang the Conqueror. So from that point onwards and backwards, I guess, Kang moved through time and space, conquering worlds. There's a lot more to the character, with a future version of him becoming Immortus, the Master of Time, another taking on the identity of the Scarlet Centurion, and there even being a council of cross-time Kangs made up of divergent versions of him, or aliens who defeated him and assumed his armour and identity. Oh god, I think I'm going to have to go lie down, but I'm scared of choking my own vomit. How terrible. Oh, and Kang also went back in time and tried to make his wimpy, younger self into a brutal conqueror by giving him his armour, but the kid ran away and became the hero Iron Lad and assembled the Young Avengers. Kang just can't catch a break, can he? If you want to read up on Kang, then I really recommend reading Avengers Forever issues 1 to 12. It's a great story featuring Avengers from a bunch of different time periods. And then there's the Kang Dynasty that runs through Avengers Volume 3, issues 41 to 55. In that story, Kang declares war on Earth, thinking it will be his final campaign before he hands his empire over to his son. But it ends with his son betraying him and Kang plunging a knife into his stomach, killing him. It's brutal and it's strangely tragic. Anyway, from all this research into the character, I took away these points. Kang has a unique look that is supposed to be 40th century neurokinetic battle armour, but in reality is a weird helmet and mask combo, a belted poncho, and thigh-high purple boots. Kang is a time traveller and has waged and won campaigns across many time periods. He's a proficient warrior with both guns and swords. Kang was previously Rama-Tut and has been known to be sentimental about that identity, retreating to that time on occasion as the people adored him and revered him like a god. Kang was also previously Iron Lad. Kang had a son who took up the Scarlet Centurion mantle and who he knifed in the gut. Wow. So yeah, Kang is a dick. Anyway, with all that in mind, I headed off to the National Museum of Scotland to do some time travelling of my own. The Egyptian exhibit threw up some neat ideas with iconography, particularly scarabs, rearing cobra symbols, which I now know are uraeus, and winged creatures and gods, and the Roman exhibit gave me some ideas for weapons and armour. I was particularly interested in the swords and the shoulder armour and the ceremonial face mask. I thought it would be a good way to work Kang's weird helmet and mask into a more grounded idea, but I didn't end up getting very far with that concept at all. But while wandering the museum, I did come across these basket-hilted swords from 17th and 18th century Scotland, which I thought just looked cool. So I had more than enough buzzing around my head to get my sketchbook out and start scribbling down ideas, starting out with a word cloud of things that jumped out at me about Kang, and then moving on to studies of how his poncho and harness have been portrayed, including looking at Iron Lad's collar. I was then trying to map some ideas onto a sketch of an action figure style body, being conscious of where the articulation points are. You can also see me start to redesign his thigh-high purple stripper boots into armoured sections that keep the overall shape of the design but make it more practical for a warrior. On the bottom right here I have a sketch of a unique bracer design that Rama-Tut wore during the Apocalypse origin story, The Rise of Apocalypse. I thought it might be cool to try and keep that as part of Kang's design. I began to try and work some other Egyptian flourishes into the design, like the scarab, the pharaoh's beard, and I simplified the uraeus symbol down to a basic design that could be placed on his helmet. Here you can see Iron Lad's collar design also working its way into Kang's armour. Both of his past selves, Iron Lad and Rama-Tut, are working their way into his visual identity now. The next series of sketches had me trying to work Roman design elements into him with the shoulder armour here, but I felt it was getting a bit too busy. I did think about the capes that Romans wore though, and sketched out how his poncho might drape round the back to become a battle-worn cape. I refined the head design a little next, really narrowing Kang's helmet design to be tight to his head and making those trademark lines on his face not just run in a straight line from top to bottom, but to follow the contours of his face, accenting his expression and stopping at his mouth. So I now had a really good idea of how I wanted Kang to look. My research was complete. So next, the actual customising. First up is finding the body parts that make sense for what I want to achieve. I needed a head with an aggressive expression, so I thought maybe Drax, Electro, Adam Magus, or maybe Archangel might work well, but those really depended on what body I was going to end up using. The head would have to be in proportion to that, after all. Kang is an awesome warrior, but he's hardly a huge burly bloke. He was a wimpy kid and a bit of a nerd as an adult, so bigger bodies wouldn't suit him. Also, as I wanted him to have good arm articulation so he could use weapons fully, I wanted him to have butterfly joints at his torso. The Sunfire body made a good choice there. As part of my redesign of him, his boots were going to become armour, so base parts that were armoured already would be a good start. So in came the arms and legs of Taskmaster. I slapped some knee pads from a Prometheus David figure on there, and I swapped out Taskmaster's Crocs for Spider-Man 2099's more tech-looking feet, and his hands for Moon Knight's. Again, as Kang was going to be wielding weapons, Moon Knight's vertical articulation on his wrists was going to be useful for posing. So with that combo of body parts, the Adam Magus head fit to proportions best. I had my base body. Now, I don't have any footage of this because it was incredibly boring and took a long time, but I started out by disassembling the base body as much as I could and dremeling and sanding all the usual parts to prevent paint rub. The most frequent question I get asked about customising is how to stop paint rub. The key is in the name. To get rid of paint rub, you get rid of the rub. Sand or Dremel points of articulation down until they don't rub together. If that means disassembling a figure, then that's what needs to be done. I'm terrible at cracking torsos apart, but I don't let that stop me from making a mess of a figure to eliminate paint rub. I can always cover any messy parts up with Sculpt later. And I really did sculpt with this figure. Sculpting to me is really just all about time and patience. I used Milliput epoxy putty for this figure, sculpting bit by bit, waiting for it to cure, and then carving into it to get clean lines and designs. The part that I got stuck on was his poncho and the harness over it. Kang's poncho is quite a complicated thing really, with pleating and folds over the chest, tucking into his belt and emerging as this nicely tailored tail section. I tried doing this myself, and while I think I'm alright at sewing rough triangles of cloth into capes, this was beyond me. I had a nice green satin I wanted to use, but I couldn't get it quite right. So I reached out to fellow UK action figure customiser and fashion designer Scoticus Customs. Initially, I asked for his advice and guidance on how to make the garment, and despite his very detailed guidance, it was still way beyond me. So I needed his direct help, and luckily he was able to help me out. While Scoticus Customs was working on the satin, I worked out how to get his harness to function. This might not seem like an obvious concern, but if you imagine a hard strap of armour running from your belt to your collar, you're not going to be able to bend forward, and that was the problem I foresaw with Kang. It had to be able to shorten when he crunched forward and extend when he leaned back, so I used a strip of craft plastic or styrene, attached it to his belt, and then cut a hole through his neck. When Kang leans forward, the styrene moves through the hole, and when he leans back, this little tab on his neck means it doesn't spring free. All this would be hidden under the sculpted collar. It was a little detail, but I enjoyed cracking this problem a lot. And speaking of the sculpted collar, I covered the figure in plastic wrap and then put a very thin layer of sculpt on top of that over his shoulders. Once that had cured and the plastic wrap was removed, it gave me a good form-fitting base to do a more detailed sculpt over. You can see a couple of test versions of his collar in my photos. I wouldn't be able to do the final one until I had the shape and design of the poncho sorted. Good job then that Scotticus Customs was super quick in getting the final poncho back to me, and he nailed it. He even sent me some work in progress pics so you can see the sort of work that goes into making something like this. I can't thank him enough for all his work and advice. Please do go check out his work on Instagram. I airbrushed some colour variations onto the poncho. Long-time viewers will know that I like to add shading and highlights to fabric in the exact same way I add them to a figure's sculpt. I use Vallejo Model Air paints, and I use an Iwata Revolution CR airbrush. I don't know if that's a good one or not, it's the only one I've ever used, and it seems to do me fine. Now, it's important to know that when you take this approach to building your figure, that is, using layers of fabric and sculpt as actual clothing and armour on a figure, it creates a lot of bulk. Sure, it can only be a few millimetres, but on a scale figure that can translate to inches in the real world. That additional material piling up on Kang's shoulders really made him look too bulky and kind of squished with a short neck. So what I ended up doing was putting a little extra length on the neck peg so that Kang's head still holds tight to the peg but sits higher than usual. It essentially extends the neck and I hope creates the illusion that his poncho and collar don't look super bulky on his shoulders. Incidentally, this is the reason that Barbie has such a long neck too. It's not simply about a preposterous body image for little girls. Well, it's kind of about that, but it's also about making a clothed figure with multiple layers not look too bulky when fully clothed. With the poncho and harness sorted, I could finish up my sculpting. I always knew the poncho was going to cover the front of the torso, so I didn't have to sculpt that, but as the back was going to be a cape, I had to fully realise that part of his armour. I had decided to make Kang's entire left arm a hint to his previous life as Ramatut, using the bracer from the Rise of Apocalypse comic and a falcon for shoulder armour. On his right arm, well, I didn't really know what to do for that, even as I started sculpting. I wanted there to be some anachronisms in his armour, so I decided to put modern day style padded armour on his forearm with a simple piece on his shoulder. I had an idea to make this shoulder armour piece articulated so that it wouldn't get in the way of his shoulder motion, but once that started taking shape and I got the collar and poncho in place, it just wasn't going to work, so it had to go. I ended up going with a much simpler plate armour design influenced by the Roman armour I had seen in the museum. Finally, I added in toe articulation. I used the technique that the great customiser Action Figure Toronto describes on his website. Go check his work and guides out if you haven't already. Moving on to Clangs Weapons, I went looking for gun parts. I wanted to try and capture this single-handed double-barreled mini chain gun thing that Kang used in the comics. I couldn't find any good fodder for this beyond a base for it in Rocket Raccoon's gun, but I checked out Forge World. They make parts for Warhammer style games, and found some admittedly quite pricey chain gun things for an attack craft or something. I attached them to Rocket's gun along with a fodder grip, and there was the gun. For his swords, I found these Kotobukiya MSG weapons online. Luckily in one pack I could get a Gladius style weapon and a basket hilted sword. That was perfect. I replaced the basket hilt with some fodder, again from Rocket's gun, to give it a futuristic feel, and I carved grooves into the Gladius with the idea being that I could paint some Tron-like light effects in it to give it a futuristic feel too. These Kotobukiya MSG weapons are really interesting, but sometimes they scale quite weirdly with Marvel Legends. They're worth looking into though. One last little weapon I added to Kang was this knife strapped to his thigh. I don't really know where the knife came from, it was just hanging around in my fodder box, but I felt that this would be a nice little nod to the end of the Kang Dynasty story and Kang's murder of his own son and heir. Kang pulled the knife from his boot in that story, so it made sense for me to make it more visible there, sculpting bindings made from the Scarlet Centurion's cape perhaps around it. And that left the painting. Using my airbrush, I primed the figure in black, then grey, then white. Priming the figure gives a good base for paint to hold to, and it also lets me test out areas for any paint rub problems while getting a good idea of how the shading on the figure is going to work. I tested a couple of paint schemes out first of all. The first I applied with a brush, but it was too heavy-handed and garish, particularly on the gold sections. I then tried a metallic purple, and while I liked how smooth it was, I just felt it looked really washed out and was going to be problematic for shading. So I stripped all that off and went back to square one, priming him again and going with a non-metallic airbrushed paint job for the most part, building up a dark purple, then a lighter purple with a magenta highlight. I added some pink edge highlights with my brush to really add contrast and pick out the sculpted details that might otherwise be lost in those big blocks of colour. I used masking liquid to help me control the areas that the airbrush was hitting. It was my first time using it, but it seemed to work well. You can see me using it in more detail in my customizing live videos. For the gold bracer and shoulder armour, I airbrushed a base of copper and then a little gold on top of that. Gold by itself can come across a little garish, so using it to highlight the copper helped counter that. I then used some silver mixed with gold paint to add very faint highlights to it. The military style padding was just painted with greens and browns using a brush. I used the light ports on Kang's armour to try and tie the design together. The legs, the belt, the collar and the face all have these bright blue light details. It also let me do something interesting with the lines on his mask being lines of energy extending from his eyes, and I think it came out looking quite intense. I also extended those light details to his weapons, again trying to make all these fodder parts and different design elements look like they belong together. Finally, I gave the whole thing a few coats with Krylon UV resistant clear acrylic coating. This sealer protects the paint from damage. It won't solve paint rub problems, as that kind of constant rubbing will take even this sealer off, but it will certainly protect the paint job from random falls off your figure shelf. And that is Kang finished. He took me a long time, but I hope you agree with me that he was worth it. I really enjoyed finding out more about him, redesigning him, trying new paint techniques, and sharing what I could with you guys via live streams. He now stands proudly next to my Dr. Doom figure, and don't tell Victor, but he stands in front of him too. Careful, Kang, you don't want to end up disintegrated like in 1984. Thank you for joining me for this workshop. I hope you've got something out of it and hopefully feel inspired to go read up on a character you're interested in but don't really know much about. Maybe give customizing a try. It doesn't have to be as super involved as I make it out to be here, or maybe just go visit a museum for an afternoon. If all that sounds like just a bit too much work though, then you could always just stick around my channel. Check out my other workshop videos or watch me work on Kang as it happened in real time via customizing live. But wherever you go from here though, thank you for watching and pour on the power. Bye bye.